Let the grilling begin. Okay. Jackson, you want to start us off? Please?
Yeah.
So I'm Jackson.
Hi.
What was your first job out of college?
I interned at WCAX
Cool.
Initially, and then I was offered like a sort of part-time fill-in kind of gig after my internship wrapped up down in Rutland. I was working out of our Rutland bureau.
Oh, cool.
And then my boss at the time, Marcellus Parsons, asked if I would work out of Burlington, like fill in, doing vacation relief kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It was sort of, there was a little bit of a deal with the college because I was supposed to get credit or get paid. It's kind of, it's a law in Vermont.
Yeah.
So, no free labor. So he would pay me like minimally. I was still getting ramen noodles,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? But that was sort of a part-time gig, and it was like very hit or miss. And then my real actual first-time job was I was a writer for the Barton Chronicle up in the Northeast Kingdom.
Cool.
So that was my first
That's
full-time
awesome.
gig. And
Um,
about a year in, I think, into that, I got the call from Marcellus asking if I'd come on
Oh,
full-time.
cool. That's awesome. What do you think is the funniest story you've ever had to do a report on? If you had to pick one right now.
Boy,
Yeah.
so many.
I know.
Maybe just because I was kind of happy with my writing out of this story, but I went to a nudist camp up in Sheldon Springs, and so it had to not only be shot, obviously, creatively, because you can't put any junk on the news,
Right.
but it also had to be, you know, I wanted to get really creative with it, and so it came out pretty funny, and you know, I was able to, you know, throw in a lot of cliches and play with words a lot to try to make it entertaining.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sarah Gonia.
Hi, Sarah.
How do you come up with ideas for special features that aren't like breaking news? Like you're not going out there right away if it's something planned?
A lot of times, you know, now with social media, people are pretty in touch. They can drop you ideas. They can say, hey, have you heard of this? If there's, you know, something in the news like heroin or something like that, you can try to enterprise something over a number of days because it takes a lot of time to butter people up to tell their story in a situation like that. But we use social media. People call us, you know, pay attention to current events, and then really try to expand beyond what that day's news is. If you, again, find the characters and wrap a story around a character, and sometimes that takes a lot of development. So, social media, phone calls, emails, and then just paying attention to what's going on and seeing if you can expand beyond what was just the day's news.
And my second question is, how does the studio, the station, approve of any kind of features that you're going to do?
There's really a team of people who kind of work on the day-to-day operations, Christine being one of them, myself, Kristen Kelly, Roger Garrity, and Garrett Hines. And our news director is there for like, can we show this image on the news? You know, if it's something that all of us as a team are like, well, this may be a call for the news director so we don't get in trouble, we would go there. But generally speaking, all of those sort of news feature ideas or what we cover day to day is really kind of a team effort in deciding where it would go in priority, like which story is going to lead the broadcast, because we look at it as a whole package, a show. So you need something that's going to be good enough to lead, to grab the attention of viewers, and then you want to end the show with something kind of featurey, more enterprise that you can, what we call bump throughout, tease throughout the entire show to get people to stick around and watch that. Either it's a good video piece or another story that you can write creatively to try to get people to stay tuned if they don't care about something that bleeds at the top of the broadcast.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Hi, I'm Jenna Madsen.
Hi.
First off, like, what's the most difficult part of interviewing people? Like, and how do you get past that?
I would say, for me personally, I think it probably depends on, you know, the person and the reporter, because some people hate interviewing politicians, for example, because they just don't care about politics or whatever. For me, it's the cold calls on a tragedy. Like, you know, if somebody has lost a child or a soldier was killed or something like that, you know, the difficult part of the job is like making that cold call, calling the family and asking if they would want to talk about the loss. Tell me about your son or daughter, you know, what are you going to miss the most? Those kind of things. It's a difficult call to make. Obviously, you know, it's a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that will resonate more with viewers if you can get that sort of character aspect and get some emotion in the story. But I'd say the cold calls on a tragedy is, for me, the most difficult.
Okay. What was the best interview experience you ever had?
Oh, man.
Or just a really good one?
You know, maybe just because this is sort of a personal situation, but a long time ago, before my grandmother passed, I got a chance, and normally you don't interview family members just because of ethics and whatever, but this was a feature piece about the Statue of Liberty. And one of the potential sites for it happened to be in Glover, Vermont, when it was a gift to the United States from France, and you know, the U.S. was kind of like, what the hell are we going to do with this giant lady? So a lawmaker in Congress said, I visited Glover, Vermont, let's just put it up there. And a New York Times editor heard about it, started writing about it because he thought it was kind of a quirky, funny idea. And then Glover started raising the money for a pedestal for it they were lobbying for it. So Glover, Vermont, I mean, come on. Well, it turns out, and I thought this was like an old wives' tale that my grandfather used to tell me with a little LTD Canadian whiskey. I'm like, yeah, okay, Grand. But one of the potential sites happened to be Perrin Hill in Glover, my family's homestead. It would have been right across the way. So just to do sort of a funny feature historical piece on the 4th of July one year, I ended up interviewing my grandmother because she would have been Liberty's neighbor. So that maybe just because of the personal you know, aspect of it, I'd say that was one of my favorite interviews. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rhea Foldy.
Hi.
Hi. So you grew up in the Northeast Kingdom, where it's hard to come by a lot of culture necessarily, and you said that yourself that you weren't a very well traveled, very well traveled as a kid.
Yeah.
So was that a challenge as you came into the world of news, or was it just kind of a more exciting way to expand your horizons?
You know, I'd say probably a little bit of both. And you know, I went to school in Vermont, and I went to a small school in Vermont, Castleton.
Right.
And so I think that I was a very curious kid, so I think that helped in wanting to learn more about other cultures. And you know, as I grew up and grew older, I've done a fair amount of world travel, but I think that it was probably a little bit of both. I was kind of naive going into learning about culture, but I was always very open-minded and curious. So in that way, I think it kind of helped because I wasn't as exposed, and so I had a lot of questions, and turns out that's what I ended up doing as a career.
Yeah.
So in some ways I think it helped, in some ways I think that, you know, I was kind of sheltered living up in the kingdom. I graduated with about 100 kids, so in a very small school.
Yeah.
So
Maybe
I
less
think
jaded.
yeah, so I think in some ways it was good, in some ways I think, you know, I wish I learned about it sooner.
Cool. My second question is, excuse me. So what do you feel is more your career goal right now? Obtaining these nominations and awards and getting recognition for these issues that you really care about, or, you know, being a steady, important part of the lives of Vermonters as like a storyteller? Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think the latter. You know, the awards are cool and it's great to be recognized and all of that, but I appreciate more being on the street, running into somebody saying, hey, we saw this story, great job, and it's really such a team effort in the news business. While the reporter may be the one who gets, you know, sort of the recognition because people see your face and they hear your voice and that kind of thing, there's such a team effort, and I'm really proud of the team that we have together, particularly the desk that I work with every day, including Christine. So I think that probably the latter, because it really is a service in some ways, and it's a real privilege to, you know, be invited into people's homes at the most triumphant times and the most tragic times as well. It's you're a witness to history, and you get to repeat that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Melanie Orcutt. Nice to meet you.
You too.
So some of your stories, such as Battle Behind the Bars, On Their Own, Killer Kids, and much more, have been recognized. And I was wondering if those are your favorite, or is it more of the smaller ones that are favorite, or if you have like one that stands out?
You know, it's a pretty wide variety of topics that I've covered over the years. I would say that probably the stories that maybe stick with me the most was I traveled to Afghanistan to embed with the Vermont National Guard, myself and a photographer at the station, Lance McKenzie. That was an incredible experience, both frightening, fascinating, educational, emotional, and you know, we were only on the ground, boots on the ground, as they say, 2 weeks, but we pulled 35 stories out of that trip that ranged from, you know, the arrest of insurgents, and you know, we were there, like 4 vehicles in front of us was bombed, to watching girls go to school for the first time. So it was such a roller coaster ride that I would say that that experience probably stands out as the one that's that I'm most proud of, and that was most fulfilling.
How long on average does it take you to write a typical story, or does it vary?
I would say sometimes it's 15 seconds if it needs to be, because of that daily deadline. You know, if you've got a small story to write, you can crank it out pretty quickly. A package, you know, a longer form where you hear the reporter's voice, you know, I try to get it done within like 45 minutes, but it's a laborious process. I mean, it's about 8 hours of work for every 1 minute of news that you see on the air, between calling, setting it up, traveling to go get it, shooting the video, getting the interviews, coming back and writing, tracking, and then going live with it, and then the editor has to edit it. So it's a pretty long process, but the writing process alone, you really don't have a lot of time. So unless it's a series piece, then you have, you know, and it's not that daily deadline story, but a daily deadline story, I'd say about 45 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet.
I'm Noah Kidney.
Hi.
You kind of just talked a little bit about this, but you called reporting in Afghanistan educational, emotional, frightening, and fascinating. And is there one particular experience from there that you remember giving you like a total culture shock, or like feeling like this is unlike anything I've reported on before?
Yeah, I would say, going back to the girls going to school, you know, it's such a different culture in that the way women are treated there. I mean, a lot of women weren't allowed, and depending, it's a very divided country, both politically and geographically. So some villages were completely cut off. They thought we were the Russians still invading the country, when in some of these villages that were so remote, excuse me, and women had to basically hide in their houses, fully covered. So when we visited this one area that had been, the Taliban had been pushed back, and they finally had a school for girls. They were trying to educate young women, and I met these two. I had a translator, and so I met these 2 girls. I think they were like 7 and 9, something like that, and they told me. I asked them. I said, "Well, you get to go to school. What are you going to do with this?" And they knew 2 like English words, and one was like teacher, and the other one was like doctor, and it was just such a realization that we take education for granted, and freedom and rights and all of that, and that these little girls were so excited to be going to school, what they called school, what looked like prison to me, because there were armed guards all around it, barbed wire encased the entire school, because the Taliban will often target any kind of scenario where girls are being educated or are not in full, you know, fully covered aside from their eyes. And so it was just a real, like, sort of, you know, stabs you in the heart to think that, you know, their lives are in danger just because they want to go to school. So I think that one stands out a lot. We met this couple on one of the trips. You know, we were able to go back to base for the most part. There were a few nights that we had to sort of camp out in this makeshift, bombed out police station. But generally speaking, we got a chance to go back to Bagram Airfield, where we had food and water and whatever, and you know, kind of a bed to sleep in. And so we met this couple. They were providing intel to the U.S. military, and so we got to sit in on one of those meetings. They had nothing. They had a goat and, I mean, dirt floors. The place was, you know, what we would consider like a homeless encampment, and they were offering us food. What they had, which was like naan bread, and so Lance and I were like, no, thank you, because we didn't want to take the last bit of food. But I quickly learned from the translator that that was a big insult not to accept something that was being offered like that. And I just thought to myself, man, like, you know, back home here, I guarantee that the general public has no idea that folks in Afghanistan can be so hospitable when they have absolutely nothing. And so I thought that was very interesting too, and something I took away.
Cool. So, second question. Many of your stories deal with topics that some would consider controversial, whether it's the transgender community or prisons. What makes you interested in reporting on these sorts of things, and have you ever faced any backlash for your interest in them?
I think what makes me interested in that is that it sort of pushes the envelope a little bit. It may open some minds a little bit. It may open some eyes a little bit to a problem that's not often talked about. So those are the stories I gravitate towards. If I'm going to do a big project, I want it to be a project that's going to raise eyebrows. I want it to be something where I feel like I'm educating the public about something on both sides. You know, that's one of the big challenges in being a journalist, is that you have to really remove yourself from the story and which was a big challenge in Afghanistan, especially because you're surrounded, you know, I mean, we weren't armed with anything aside from a camera, a notepad, and a pen. So in some ways, you know, you relied on the military to protect you in sort of a scenario where you were going into an unknown territory. But you still had to remove yourself from that story to report on it accurately and fairly and objectively. But those are the kind of stories that I like, because it challenges me personally as a journalist to, you know, look at both sides of an issue. So transgender, for example, I was really proud of, I recently did another story on transgender. One of the, you know, most high-profile CEOs in Vermont recently came out in my story for Vermont to know that she is transgender. But I had done something when people weren't really talking about transgender several years ago, when that word was sort of just starting to sort of, people were like, well, what the hell does this even mean? And so that raised a lot of eyebrows. You know, that got some viewer feedback, like, why are you putting this on the news, kind of thing. But on the flip side, it gave a voice to some people who hadn't had one before, and I was kind of proud of that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Caleb.
Hi.
So this is a pretty simple question to start off, but did you always know that you wanted to go into broadcasting?
I was pretty lucky as a kid. I knew very young. My grandfather was a news junkie, and if I was a good boy throughout the week, my reward at the end of the week was I got to spend the night on Saturday nights at my grandparents' house. And every Sunday morning, you know, I'd wake up early with him. I idolize this guy. So I would watch him watching CBS Sunday Morning and just soaking up this information. And so I was like, this is something I should pay attention to. And pretty early on, I fell in love with that kind of long-form storytelling that you see on CBS Sunday Morning. And so it wasn't long after I loved the news more than I loved cartoons. And so I knew early on that I wanted to be some kind of storyteller, whether it was going to be print or broadcast. I wasn't sure, you know, I was a kid, but I knew that, and I loved writing, so I knew early on that, you know, 5, 6 years old, that I wanted to do some kind of storytelling. Did I know that it would lead to a broadcast career? No, but I knew storytelling was in my future.
Oh, okay. So speaking of print or broadcasting, you worked at the Chronicle. What was the transition from newspaper to like newsroom for you? How was that?
It was interesting because I sort of struck a deal. I actually was working part-time I stayed on, well, I started part-time at the station, I guess. And that was very short-lived. I had a deal with the Chronicle that as long as I didn't cover Orleans County, I could keep both jobs, and then I went full-time. But it was, you know, I was on the fence about whether or not I wanted to get into broadcast, because I really loved the freedom that print gave in some ways, because you could do your entire story by sitting in your office. There was no travel time. You had no limits on, generally speaking, the amount of writing you could do. Versus when you get to broadcast, you have to tell that, you know, pages and pages of story in 2 minutes. So that was the big challenge in trying to pare down the nuggets of a big story into 2 minutes. So you had every word counts in broadcast because they get one shot to hear it. It's not like the paper where you can go back and reread it if you don't understand something. So in broadcast, you have to make it simple, you have to make it tight, and so that was the big challenge going from paper to broadcast. And for a little while, I was doing both, and I was kind of like, you know, that was the challenge. I put on my broadcast hat on Saturdays, and then, you know, throughout the week, I was writing long form for the newspaper, which was very comparable to 7 days, so long, really long stories. So that was a big challenge, and honestly, at first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to make that jump because I really liked writing for the paper. I learned a ton they were all veteran reporters there. But yeah, that was the big challenge between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm
Hello.
Bessie.
Hello.
Have you always known you'd likely stay in Vermont, or did you ever dream of leaving and trying something else?
Yeah, you know, when I was a lot younger, I thought that I probably would, since I was born here, educated here. I kind of thought that I might want to, you know, check out another area, and some opportunities did present themselves over the years, and I took the free trips to go check out other stations when there are like headhunters in this business. So if, like, Hearst Argyle wants to knock out, you know, one of the anchors at another station, they'll make an offer, try to sweeten the deal on getting you to move elsewhere. So I took a couple of free trips. I entertained the idea when I was younger. But I love Vermont. I care about the stories that I'm telling, and the issues here matter to me because I live here. My family lives here. I have a huge family in the kingdom. I have 50 first cousins. So in that's what really sort of has kept me here mostly. The other thing is that, you know, the station is one of like 5 locally owned left in the country, and I like the fact that I can, if I got a problem, I can go to the owner of the station who's just down the hallway and chat with him about it versus a corporate sort of scenario. So that's another reason that's sort of kept me around,
Okay.
but those are the big ones.
Great. And can you think of one really embarrassing faux pas you made when you first started working in news?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, there are a few, but one in particular, I was pretty new on the job, maybe like a month in or something like that, working the morning show with Christine. And so we used to do this thing called Daybook, and it was kind of like, you know, the new, like, here's what's coming up later today. So Jack LeDuc, this was back in tapes, when were using tapes, so back in NOM. And Jack LeDuc used to feed from New York, and I looked in the rundown, which is like the story placement, and I thought I had probably about 2 minutes to run Jack's tape upstairs. It was just kind of raw video, because we used to have to edit his stuff, but it was a story that we needed, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, all right, I've got 2 minutes to run this upstairs, get back downstairs to be in front of the camera to then go live. Well, I didn't know this, but Christine had, for timing reasons, had dropped one of the stories in between those two hits. And so I'm running the tape upstairs, and it wasn't airing. It was going to air after me, but I thought I could, like, you know, maximize my time, get that up, be fine, blah, blah, blah. So I get upstairs, and at the time, the what we call the bridge was positioned this way. So Christine didn't see me, but she picked up the phone to Paige on the overhead and said, "Darren, get in front of that camera, you have 20 seconds. And I'm standing in back of her on the second floor, and I needed to be on the first floor. I said, "Oh my God," and Christine looked up, she's like, "Oh my God, run!" So I like chucked the tape to the tape guy. At the time, we were both kids, so now we would have just dropped my segment and moved it down in the show, but at the time, both of us were rookies, and we were like, I was like, shit. So I'm flying down 2 flights of stairs. I get in front of the camera. I go to put the microphone on my tie, and it's hooked on the back of the chair. So my tie is out sideways like this. My earpiece is hanging on my shoulder. Eleanor, who was the anchor at the time, is speaking very deliberately, trying to give me a couple moments, because Christine was like, "He's not there, talk slowly." So she's being like, "So now we're going to go to Darren in the newsroom. Good morning, Darren." And I was like, "Good morning!" I couldn't speak, so they cut away from me because I just couldn't talk at all. And, you know, again, my earpiece is hanging out, my tie is like this. I'm trying to tuck my body under my tie. And they cut away, and my mic was still on, and I said, "Oh, hell." Something like that. I said hell or something, or damn it. And Joe was running the camera at the time. He pulled his headphones off. He's like, "Your voice is still on." And I was like, so I'm only 2 weeks in or something like that, or 2 months in. It wasn't very long. And so, you know, I was like, I called my parents, and I was like, "I'm going to be moving back in with you pretty soon, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to lose my job." So we got like 10 phone calls in the newsroom. They were like, "How's the young boy with the asthma attack?" Everyone thought I had an asthma attack on the air. It was a nightmare for me. So, yeah, that's one.
It's better than I expected. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Kayla. Nice to
Hi.
meet you. And so I was wondering, you mentioned that your interest for news and whatnot was a surprise to your family. What was their reaction when they found out?
That I wanted to get into this business? You know, it was interesting because I think that they knew I loved the news because they saw me watching it, you know, throughout the years, and everything stopped at my parents' house, like, while I was growing up at 6 o'clock, you know, it was like, everything stopped, everybody watched the news, or at least, you know, my parents did, and I was right there along with them because I just loved the news. I think that my grandfather in particular was really excited about it because he obviously was a news junkie as well. And my parents were proud that I was willing to sort of, you know, take the leap and try to do something that's a very challenging career to get into. But I think that they were excited and still are. You know, Dad calls me Little Dan Rather. So, yeah, I think they were excited about it and still are seeing it. And you know, I think they're probably my most faithful viewers.
All right, and so now that you're more of an anchor than like a reporter going out and being in the field, is there anything you miss about that?
I miss reporting a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of being an anchor and producer, because Kristen and I, my co-anchor, and I shared the producing duties on the 6 o'clock show. And that job entails a lot of like crossing T's, dotting I's, keeping track of crews, you know, sort of day-to-day operational stuff. That's my least favorite part of the job. I like writing, I like getting a story, I like getting someone to spill their guts to me. Like I feel like, you know, mission accomplished when you know, get somebody at the point where they're, you know, almost raw and telling you a story. You feel almost like a therapist sometimes in doing the job. We were joking about getting people to cry, but I am kind of known for that at the station for whatever reason. And here's a tip for you in helping you to get the best sound you'll ever get is after the awkward pause. So if you're interviewing somebody and it's something a little bit emotional and they answer and they stop because they're getting emotional, sit there like this. Because they're going to want to, they're feeling very vulnerable. This is terrible, I know. But it's the most vulnerable part, but it's going to be the part that they appreciate in the long run as well because it's the most real. That awkward pause, they then fill it and they keep going and then they tell more of their story because there's this moment of like, and this. So it's, for me, it's a challenging thing to do because you want to be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, or whatever. So you have to take yourself out of it. You have to take your emotion out of it. You can be emotional after with them and you know, express condolences or something like that. But take a couple deep breaths and just sit there and wait for them to start speaking again because that's when you're going to get your best sound. Is that the question you asked me?
Kind of. It was what if you missed anything about, but you
Those
answered
moments
that.
are because I feel like you get somebody to open up and then you have your story because it's all about character and building a story. You wrap it around them, and if they express emotion that you can really work with as a writer, you're going to have a good story.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Abby.
So you talked a little bit about your grandfather. Who are some other role models or people that inspired you?
Sure. I would say early on in my career, Tina Starr, she was an editor at the Chronicle, and Bethany Dunbar, another writer at the Chronicle. I learned a ton from them because they taught me how to get a story, who to go to, that it was important to have a pool of sources who you could tap for, you know, if you're like, oh, shit, I have nothing today. Make the phone calls, call all your sources, what are you hearing? Sometimes it's gossip, and sometimes gossip is legit. Sometimes it's BS, but I learned how to be a reporter from them. Marcellus gave me my break. I valued his news judgment and still do, and I think that his legacy still lingers on being accurate and fair and telling both sides of a story. That he was very he was a stickler for that, and grammar. So I learned a ton from him as well. But I would say that those three professionally are the folks that I looked up to most as a young reporter.
Great. Okay, so what is the coolest place that you've traveled for a story? Or like the most fun?
Most fun. Oh, I can't lump Afghanistan in there. You know, after Afghanistan, we caught up with a Vermont soldier who was one of the most critically wounded. He lost his legs, he died twice on the table, he suffered strokes, he lost use of his arm, he had a traumatic brain injury, he was a mess. And his wife, Karen, his name was Ed, and she was a medic in the military as well. They were both serving in Afghanistan, so after he was blown up, she rushed to his side trying to save his life as his wife also. And their story was just so compelling to me that we followed them through his rehabilitation, which is still ongoing. I mean, and this was in 2010. So he's still in rehab, and probably will be for, I mean, who knows how long. And I had interviewed them way back when, and they still had a dream to have children. Doctors were like, meh, pretty unlikely. I mean, you know, he had a lot of lower body injuries, and so it was very doubtful that this was going to happen for them. But the incredible amount of love between these two people was just overwhelming. I mean, like, you know, you can't help it. Again, you try to take yourself out of a story, but seeing her care for him was just incredible. So we decided to take a trip to San Antonio, Texas. Twice we went. And I would say, just because, like, I got so much out of it personally, and seeing, you know, this couple just be incredibly good to each other. And then they had twin babies. And so we went in and we followed up on that story as well, and it was really cool.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi.
So I'm gonna see if these questions are kind of a bit might be cutting towards a line, so I'm gonna ask about them anyways because that's the thing.
Because that's
So,
what you do.
So journalism has kind of a social responsibility to viewers. There's a whole code of ethics, and have you ever been in a position where you have a story that you very much want to get out there, but you haven't been able to because of just you haven't had the place or time to do so, or higher up said you can't do it?
Good question. Boy. You know, I can't think of anything right now, and maybe it's because we are locally owned, so we don't have that corporate, you know, idea of what news should look like and what Vermont news should look like, and everyone has to look the same and dress the same and all of that business. We don't deal with any of that. Can you think of anything that
Well, there are stories we haven't aired because we don't have all the
confirmation
things that we, or things that we've decided are too inside baseball, maybe.
yeah, like procedural or that kind of thing, but no, like ethical dilemma. I can't think of anything that
Ethics that have killed a story.
Yeah, is it, that's what you mean, like
Yeah.
something like that? Can you think of anything that's like, or like the higher ups said that's too controversial to touch? I think we have a lot of freedom at the station to pursue those kind of stories, and actually I think the station does a really good job of that. We have an hour-long broadcast, so we have a bit more freedom to dive into an issue that may be overlooked by another news media because they only have half an hour and they can't explain an issue and get every side in because they don't have the time, frankly, or resources. We have a huge stable of reporters, but nothing is really coming to mind. Let me think about it a little bit longer as well, if anything stands out, but I can't think of a story that's been killed by the higher ups.
I can't either.
No.
Cool. That's actually a good answer. That's what you want to hear. And also, have you ever let personal bias unintentionally get into a story, or at least come close to it, like one that's actually gone out?
Boy, I hope not. I don't think so. I think that that's one of my strong suits, even if I care deeply about an issue. But I don't think so. I think that probably even my bosses would say that I'm good at removing myself from a story to be, and I think that this goes back to Marcellus, my predecessor, who really made sure that his stable of reporters were fair and accurate, but fair mostly, and well, accurate as well. I guess that's pretty important. But those two things were critical, and I learned from the best because I was a rookie. I was, you know, there were probably 15, 20 year spread, because back when I first got into business, nobody left. So all of the reporters there were, had me by 20 years or something. So a lot of them put me under their wing and showed me how it's done and done correctly. And it really stemmed from the top, which at the time was Marcellus. And he would have never put up with that shit. He would have been like, no way, start over. So if you had any kind of slant on a story, that just was not allowed. So even if you do care about it, that is a challenge for, again, and that's sort of what I enjoy those stories, again, because I think they challenge me personally. But yeah, I don't think so.
Awesome.
Honestly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Riley.
Hey.
So my first question is, so nowadays, most people get their news like online, like very instantly, and so do you find it difficult, or rather more difficult, for the field of journalism to operate in a more like broadcast setting, like what you and like Christine do nowadays, or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the fastest growing part of the company now is our online presence and social media and our web. And everything that happens in broadcast and more goes now to the web as well, because people want that instant, they don't have time, or they want to watch news when they want to watch news. We have our app so that you can watch it on demand, but there has been a major adaptation of what news is. Those days that I was talking about when everything stopped at 6 o'clock with my parents and you sat down and you watched the news, that's, I mean, unless they're 50 or 60 years old, that's probably not happening anymore. So we've had to figure out ways to adapt, and it all sort of intertwines now, cross-promotion. So we'll give something on social media that people get a little taste of the news, and then hopefully it's enough to draw them to the show that night, not giving everything away so that they'll want to tune in as well. But it all it's like one big ball now, and like this helps this aspect, this helps this aspect, and it all sort of intertwines. Because gone are the days of just waiting until 6 o'clock to break a story. Oftentimes we try to like hold off on tweeting something out until we know the governor's out of his office and Channel 5's not going to be able to confirm this. So we may wait a little bit on, but we try to get it out now. You try to break your news on different avenues now than we used to. So it's an interesting and ever evolving, Instagram, Periscope. I mean, we're branching out in all different directions.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, so you've talked a lot about like the weeks that you spent in Afghanistan and kind of like the difficulties there. So aside from your time in Afghanistan, has there ever been like a story that had like a very strong emotional toll on you that made it difficult to finish the reporting?
Maybe two, actually. So I like the challenging stories, and I covered a series called Suffering in Silence. There were two, Dirty Secrets and Suffering in Silence. One dealt with domestic abuse, which unfortunately in the news is often kind of overlooked. This is sad but true. If you hear on the scanner somebody being beaten or threatened or whatever, back when we first started even, it was like, oh, this is probably a domestic. Like, that doesn't matter. So I wanted to look at that. I was like, why do we have that reaction, even in the newsroom, that these women, generally, mostly, are suffering at the hands of somebody who allegedly cares about them? So I wanted to dive into that, and I found this woman who, her story was just heartbreaking. I mean, she was beaten for years, almost to the point of death one time, and was so open in sharing her story, and her abuser, her ex-husband, he was about to max out after 5 years. He spent 5 years in prison because he tried to kill her with a knife, and she was locked in her bathroom, and he was like putting the knife through the door trying to kill her. So I think that her story was just so vivid, and the photos that she provided of her last attack were just like, holy shit. It brings something like that really home, and that resonated with, I got a ton of feedback from, again, primarily women who had, you know, suffered similar scenarios. So I think that that one was particularly emotional. And then I did a story, the Dirty Secrets series, which dealt with child molestation. And I interviewed this woman who had been molested by her dad from the time she was like 4 until she was probably 17 or something. Well, it turns out he was a serial molester, and he had molested about 100 kids in town. So that one was another one that was like, but again, it goes back to that character. And if they can share such intimate parts of their life, you have a good story. But, you know, you think about that later, like, wow, you know, you've been able to write about this person and the horrible things that they've gone through. You crank it out, you put it out, you let it air, you process it after, though, like, wow, you know, like, one, it's a privilege that they shared this with me to hopefully help somebody else, give somebody else a voice, maybe make somebody aware of the terrible things that happen when something like this happens.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Dylan.
Hi.
What was it like the first time one of your stories was nominated for an award? What were you feeling?
I was pretty pumped. I think, I'm trying to remember, it was probably a Murrow Award. Yeah, I was pretty excited. But I would say that probably the 2 nominations in particular were pretty exciting for me. I was nominated for a GLAAD Award for a story tackling transgender issues, and I was up against like competition there. It was like Oprah and Ellen and PBS. I was the only non-network reporter nominated that year, so I'm like, you know, little low man on the totem pole here, and just was pretty excited about it. Didn't get the award, PBS, but that was pretty exciting. I've been nominated for I don't know, maybe like 9 or 10 Emmys, but it's always exciting because you always feel like your hard work is, you know, being acknowledged. That, you know, because it takes a lot of time and effort, particularly in one of the series that we were just chatting about. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done before it goes to air. So it's always exciting. But the GLAAD Award was pretty cool just because of the bigwigs that I was up against.
Okay. And who was the most difficult person you've ever interviewed, and why?
Oh my God, I had a nickel. I've been spit on. I've been threatened. That happened a lot, though. It was like when I was doing the crime beat, you know, it was like I was backing up Brian Joyce. He was our main crime reporter at the time. So, you know, trying to get a criminal to talk about why'd you do it is probably, but I don't know if anything of more substance. Sometimes politicians are a real pain in the ass. Getting them to sort of talk about a mistake they've made. I can't think of it as individual. Can you think of somebody who's like really a pain?
Particularly combative, or just
Mostly-
not answering your questions, being evasive.
I'd chalk that up to almost any politician I've talked to.
Is there like one politician in particular that stands out?
Do I have to drop names? Where's this going?
It's going on the web.
Okay. How about this? I'll say this. A couple years ago, we were doing 30 schools in 30 days. It was a look at 30 schools in 30 days, different things happening at schools across the state. I tried to interview Harwood Union High School. Did you go there?
Yeah.
Lisa Atwood?
Oh gosh.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So they've had this program in place. It was the first school to hand out condoms in the state. So I wanted, again, I like those controversial stories. So, but it really wasn't going to be that controversial in my mind because the state health department was pointing at Harwood as an exemplary school that does it well, and that they have a really low pregnancy rate and STI rate and all this business. So I was like, well, why aren't more schools in Vermont using this model to keep kids healthy and pregnancy free? So I called the school. We had this great old video of when it first started from the nurse there, who was still there, and I wanted to talk with her. And she was like, no, I did this once. I'm not talking about this again. So then I was kind of like, what is going on here? This is still controversial 20 years later. So I called the principal, I called the vice principal. They put me off for weeks and weeks and weeks. And normally in this business, that's too long. But I was like, I want to do this story. So I was being a little bit bullheaded, and I was like, no, this is a story that should be told. The state health department is saying, you guys are doing it well. What's the problem here? And so they kept putting me off. They're like, oh, we'll get back to you next week. And then it was in an email, and I had all of this documented. And then finally I said to them, listen, if you're not going to talk to me, you're going to see me outside the school tomorrow, standing there with a microphone saying, I wanted to talk to them about this program that's been going on 20 years, but they're not talking. It's so controversial. It's still so controversial. They're not talking. And they were like, well, that wouldn't be fair. I'm like, well, it seems pretty fair to me because you're not willing to go on camera to talk about this. So that's what I did. I went in front of the school, did this whole piece about safe sex and the number of schools who were doing it, but that Harwood they were being total obstacles about wanting to do this story that initially started out as going to be a positive story on safe sex education in schools across the board, using them as an example of how it's been done well for 20 years. They were the first. But instead it turned into a piece about, this is still so controversial, they're not saying a word. And it led to a whole storm of they sent out a note to people saying that I had made that up, but I had all this documentation showing that they were putting me off, and then I met a meeting with the superintendent and all this BS because they should have just said, we covered that, we don't want to talk about it anymore, it's going well, there's our statement, or send out a statement, or something like that. But instead it was like this cat and mouse game that they were trying to pull, and so I ended up having to do a story about the cat and mouse game instead of a safe sex education program. So there's a recent example.
Thank you.
All right. So everyone's asked her 2 questions. Does anyone have any more questions? We can kind of do a...
Yep.
Still
She had
come
her
over
hand
here,
up
though, so we
first,
can hear
right
the
there.
question.
Oh, okay.
Please.
I had a question a little bit further about this condom story. I don't know if it's like this.
Do whatever you want. Yeah, just ask it over here.
Just a quick question.
But I was just wondering, why you think that they were so against being able to talk about it, if it is something that they were, providing for their students, why they wouldn't want recognition? Or, did it seem like it was, really not taken well by the community still, or something?
It's a great question, and I tried to get them to answer that, but they just absolutely would not even, as soon as I said condom, they were shut down. And I think that maybe they got some backlash when it initially began, and they just didn't want to see history repeat itself because a lot of people didn't even know it was still happening. Because the policy there, from my understanding, and perhaps you can weigh in on this, was that it wasn't like the health director or nurse wasn't being like, here, have some condoms, kids. But it was more like there's a drawer in the nurse's office, and then if you need condoms, you just go in there and get it. Is that pretty much how it rolled?
Yeah, I actually wasn't even aware that they were offering it. I was wondering how long ago you did the story.
Last year?
Okay.
I think it was last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I graduated
in 2013 from Harwood, and I don't even remember them even telling us that that was available. So.
Yeah, so apparently it's still kind of like a hush-hush deal, and I think that they're just worried about any kind of sort of backlash from the community, or some parents would be pissed that, that this is an option for their kids, and so I just think they didn't want it in the news at all that they did this, and because they didn't want to deal with any kind of, history.
I guess, like, why do it at all, though, if you're not willing to talk about it still?
Another great question. But I don't think they'll ever give an answer.
Not now.
That's yeah, especially not now. They're not a big fan of this guy.
All right. As you can see here, Christine is our teacher. Have you ever taught for college or university or anything? And since you haven't, have you ever considered it?
I've thought about it. Yeah, I've thought about it. I've given a lot of talks at schools and that kind of thing, and I like young people, and I did pick Christine's brain about it a couple years ago. I was considering it then. I have thought about it, but never took the step. Not sure I'm ready for all the work.
No problem. You would be good.
Thank you. Well, thanks.
Anyone else? All good? Okay, Darren, I'm going to ask you one.
Oh, God.
So you talk about buttering up people. I'm Christine.
Oh, hey, Christine.
Hi. So you talk about getting people to talk. You got to butter them up before you start rolling. What is your technique for buttering up a potential interview subject?
So a lot of times there's a lot of sort of preamble before you start the interview. I do a lot of legwork on the phone or via email, talking, if it's a controversial or something where I may get somebody to cry. I want them to trust me, because that is, no one's going to spill their guts unless they feel like there's a connection in some way. So, tell me about your son. Tell me, and that's a great way to open it up. If you're interviewing somebody, don't launch with a question about, like, oh, are you upset with the military because your son is dead? I always start with, tell me about your son. And then oftentimes they will, they want to talk about, their kid that has passed or whatever it may be. In some ways, I think that some people view it as a little bit therapeutic, because now everybody in the state gets to know how cool this kid was before they passed away or something like that. So I really try to reach out on, via email, and a phone call is really important, I think. Hearing the voice, talking.